My name is Penn Peary, and I am the senior pastor here at First Presbyterian Church, and I welcome you to First Pres on behalf of our staff and congregation. I'm glad that you are here for what we hope will always be not just a church program for our members, but a community conversation about things that matter in our city, which is our home. In 1968, 20-year-old Charles R. Willard Jr., a member of this church, left his home and family in Charlotte to enlist in the Army. Never shy of adventure, Charles joined the Army Rangers and in 1970 found himself on a reconnaissance behind enemy lines in Vietnam. His missions provided valuable information to the American effort, but eventually cost him his life. Back here at First Presbyterian, his parents, Charlie and Lydia Willard, were eager to keep his memory alive, and we are grateful for the long-term impact of a fund they established in Charles's name that supports the event called the Willard Lecture. The Willard Lecture series has brought impactful speakers who raise awareness of relevant issues such as justice, human dignity, inclusion within the context of our faith. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to say a word of thanks to the people who worked hard to make tonight's event happen. First and foremost, a woman who hates it when I say her name from the pulpit, Gerald Kiesler. Where's Gerald? You're welcome, Gerald. As well as the Willard Committee that has been working for more than a year to help tonight happen. As always, also a word of thanks to Ben Treese on my staff and our communications and custodial staff who have put in many, many hours. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome our 33rd Willard Lecturer, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, the 16th president of Union Theological Seminary in New York. Woohoo! A highly respected scholar and public intellectual, she occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. Dr. Jones came to Union after 17 years at Yale University, where she was the Titus Street Professor of Theology at the Divinity School and chair of the university's program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She is frequently invited by the media to comment on major issues impacting society because of her deep grounding in theology, politics, women's studies, economics, race studies, history, and is there anything you don't know? She's the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace, Theology in a Ruptured World, and her memoir, Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. Her personal and observed experiences prompted her to learn more about trauma and to explore the power of telling one's story as a path in which trauma is interrupted by the gift of God's love. First Presbyterian is committed to mental wellness and strives to maintain awareness of the impact that adverse childhood experiences have on our ministry partners around the city. And we hope that through tonight's program, we will learn more about the role our community can play in healing individual, cultural, intergenerational trauma from President Jones. Let me say a word about what's going to happen. First, Dr. Jones is going to speak, give us a lecture, and second, Dr. Jones and Dr. Johnson, who you'll meet from Hopeway in Charlotte, will have a conversation. And following their conversation, you will be invited to ask questions and engage with our speakers by coming to the microphone at the front of the sanctuary in the aisle. I'll let you know when to do that. If you stand up and try that while they're speaking, people will look at you funny. So wait till I tell you to come up and do that. Thank you. Before Dr. Jones begins, if you are comfortable, I would invite you to join me in prayer. God of the ages, we who are inevitably shaped by the actions of the past, particularly the trauma of the past that rends our present and impacts the trajectory for our future, we also dare to believe that beyond us and what we can always know or understand, you are present. And so help us to trust where we cannot see and to believe that your promises are more real than we could dare to imagine. Be with us tonight in our listening and in our conversation. We ask it in faith. Amen. Dr. Jones.
So hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation to deliver the Willard lecture. I hadn't realized the story of Charles Willard, and hearing it just now, his passing in Vietnam as a ranger, I can't help but feel he would be particularly moved by this evening's topic. In honor of all of his fellow veterans that were with him in Vietnam. And I know in our conversation, we'll come back and talking about trauma, and that will be part of it. So it's a very poignant connection there to these lectures. So I also want to say thank you to Gerald and to the whole committee for all the work you put into this and for inviting me. I have heard so much about this wonderful church and past lectures, and I'm very honored to be here. But I'm going to be talking about a tough topic. I have to tell you just a funny story to get it started. So I started working on trauma now about, this is going to age me, but not that that's hard to do, but about 40 years ago, at the beginning of my graduate school work. At that time, Yale had the largest collection, it was called the Fortunoff Archive, of recordings of Holocaust survivors. And unlike the Holocaust Museum in DC, the Fortunoff Archives were orchestrated by a set of psychoanalysts who were living in New Haven at the time. And instead of asking survivors to tell a particular story guided by questions, in these archives, they simply asked someone to sit down and to start talking. And what was remarkable about this is that it didn't require telling a coherent story. It didn't have a beginning, as for most people. It didn't have an end. It was just a stream of consciousness of images and moments and flashes. Part of the challenge is that it didn't have an ending, most of these stories. They just sort of moved into a future space, but so much was left hanging in silence. And oftentimes, when it came to the facts of the story, they would get particular facts actually wrong. But that didn't matter, because what was being narrated by them was the flashpoints, the moments, the feelings of that traumatic experience. It was out of these archives, and actually in not the psychology department, but the comparative literature department, that what is now referred to as, quote, trauma theory began to emerge in the university as a topic of study in comparative literature departments to examine how it is across time and throughout history that traumatic events, be they individual events or massive collective events, how we tell the story of what happened. And the question that sits at the center of this, when it's studied from that perspective as a challenge of storytelling, is traumatic events actually have the capacity to, if you will, disable our storytelling functions. So what we're often left with when we look at history is a history of the coherent periods where we're capable of telling stories, and deep and vast silences about those parts of our history where the violence was so pervasive and so intense that the traumatic effect of that is such that it leaves the community and its individual community members, in a sense, speechless. That's why throughout the history of Judaism and of Christianity, we find in our scriptures tales that are tales of traumatic violence, in which the storyteller is trying to bring out of history those traumatic events and set them in the context of a story that can be told. I begin with this because telling those stories is a mighty task. And I told my daughter, who was there coming home from school every day as I was writing my first book on trauma, and I told her I was coming to Charlotte to do a talk on trauma, and she goes, "Oh no, not trauma again. Mom, stop it. You have to get over this." So if you have that reaction as I'm talking, just know you're in good company with my daughter, who regrets the fact I'm even here. It's an important topic to talk about, particularly this time of year in the Christian community, because here we are, a week before Holy Week. We're moving into a time that is the most important, pivotal moment in the story that we tell about the meaning of our lives, about God with us. And what sits at the center of that story is the most traumatic, torturous death one can possibly think of: the crucifixion of Jesus, told in painful detail. The gospel writers do not want to spare us the agony of that story. And we have to ask a question: what does it mean that as a Christian community we have a story of vivid traumatic violence that sits right at the center of our understanding of who God is? What this says is that speaking of trauma and moving into those spaces that cannot be spoken and speaking them is not just a side feature of our faith. It is absolutely central to it. Also, going into Holy Week, not only do we have the story here of the crucifixion, but we have the story of these disciples who are running around showing all the effects of what we often refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Their leader has been arrested. They know he's going to be arrested. They know he's being hunted. What do they do when they go to the garden with him when he prays? They can't even stay awake. They fall asleep. The impulse to shut down and to deny the force of the violence that is unfolding around them is so strong, they can't even keep their eyes open. And talk about a feature of the after effects of traumatic violence and our capacity to not want to tell the story and to move into this space of denial. We literally have the tale next to the crucifixion of the repeated denial of Peter. He can't claim his space, his friendship, his love, his proximity in the most intimate ways to this horrific event that is about to unfold. So it's an important time of year for us to be reflecting together on the place of trauma in our understanding of who Jesus is, who we are as Christians, and then, of course, the increasingly and ever compoundingly world we live in today, where it seems trauma upon trauma upon trauma descends upon us. One of my most important personal poems has a phrase in the middle of it that I think captures this moment in time so well with respect to trauma. And he says, it's a poem entitled "The Company of Strangers." He says, "Hear the breaking thunder of the icebergs as they crack. Hear the flow and the gush of the ages, as all of the harms of the past come up to meet us all at once. and they will not let us go until we take the greatest stride humanity has ever taken. And it feels like we live in one of those moments when all of the harms of the past have come up to take a hold of us all at once and will not let us go until we face into, layer by layer, historical traumas, communal traumas, family traumas, our own personal, buried and still unspoken traumas. All of it coming up to hold on to us, and even when we're not aware of it and we're in state of Peter's denial, refusing to let go of us until we stride towards it. So I've talked now generally about trauma in the Christian context and in our present world, but let me just say a word about what I mean when I use this word trauma. It's one of those words that today is so overused in some senses that it ceases to have any precise meaning. It just kind of refers to something unfortunate that happens. Oh my God, I'm so traumatized. So in a sense, it's a word that's kind of, perilously close to you losing its force. And yet it's also a word that is being used often because we are beginning as a society to understand more about what is meant by this word, trauma. Now, I am not a clinician. I have no specific training in psychology. We are going to hear from a brilliant clinician in the conversation when I finish my comments here in a minute. But in the literature on trauma, a traumatic event is described like this. It is an event that can happen to an individual, it can happen to a community, it can also happen to someone proximate to an individual. But an individual who experiences an event of overwhelming violence. And I'll just pause there for a minute. Overwhelming violence. This term overwhelming is important because it captures the sense of a traumatic event being one that overwhelms our capacity as human beings to comprehend what is happening. I often use this image of thinking of our brains as a kind of circulation desk in a library. And most of the information that we choose to remember in the course of our daily events comes in and we put like a number on it, and then we put it on a shelf, and we know how to go back and get it. And that's called, that's a very crude analysis of our memory. What happens in traumatic events, and this is the quality of overwhelming, is it's coming at you so fast and it so exceeds your natural cognitive capacities that it's as if it jumps over the circulation desk and goes right into the stacks of your brain, in fact, goes right deep into your primitive brain, your amygdala, and it wanders there. But it never gets cataloged because most of us don't have language for it. And when it's happening, it's coming so fast, you can't sort of pull up your frontal lobe, your frontal cortex, and nicely order what's going on. Now, as the definition of trauma continues, a person experiences an event of overwhelming violence, and then this is important, in which they feel threatened with annihilation. So this isn't just, falling off your bike, although there's events in which you could see that might, in fact, have that flavor to it, but this threatened with annihilation, traumatic events call into question your own ability to survive them. And to be annihilated is not simply to die, but it is to be wiped out. And that goes back to this notion of overwhelming and cognitive non-comprehension. So annihilation, threatened with annihilation. And then as we go on in the definition, an event of overwhelming violence in which you're threatened with annihilation and against which you are helpless to respond. That's a very crucial part of this understanding of a traumatic event. Because it's not only that you can't understand what's happening, it's coming too fast, and you know your very existence is at stake, but you can't fight it. You can't push back at it. You can't stop it. And what happens because of that is not only does your brain do strange things, but your own sense of agency in the world, your sense of your own capacity to act and affect the world around you gets, in a sense, disabled. So here we have these traumatic events are turning off so many of our coping mechanisms, and they leave us incredibly vulnerable. And one of the most vulnerable dimensions of this is they don't come to the level easily of storytelling, and that's one of the work of healing, is to bring them to that level. But they often cut us off from community, because in these kinds of events, the experience is you're being attacked from the outside, and your experience is that the world, that other people, that the other, in whatever form that takes, is the source of the harm. So creating a kind of armor around yourself that protects you from other people makes sense, and yet absolutely crucial to the process of healing is not just trying to knit back together a coherent story of what happened, but to do so in the context of a community of witnesses who can hold you, who can hear you, and who can move with you into the future. So one of the most interesting things that's happening today in the field of trauma studies, more broadly conceived, is more and more research, as our other conversation partner will talk about, on the effect of trauma on our bodies, how we somaticize it. And we're going to be talking about a book that I open my courses on trauma at Union with. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And actually I gave a recent lecture entitled The Body of Christ Keeps the Score. Just a little hint there that we are collectively a body, and we talk about being the body of Christ. What does it mean to think about our connectivity and practices as bearing many of them unconscious marks of the traumas that have flowed through us? The second book that I recommend touches on the area of thinking about collective and intergenerational trauma. That it's not just something that happens to a single person, but happens to communities. And the Holocaust literature was one of the first steps in this direction. But there's a book by Resmaa Menakem entitled My Grandmother's Hands. His grandmother's hands are the hands of his grandmother, who as a child was enslaved, and it's the scars on her hands from picking cotton. And in this book, which is written for communities, he goes through the process of talking about the construction of whiteness, the construction of white supremacy, the construction of racism and anti-blackness in this country being itself a collectively traumatizing, sustained traumatizing event, extended over time for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in framing it this way, he puts the issue of annihilation right there in front of us, and he puts the questions of denial right there in front of us, and dealing with the consequences of not engaging or refusing or not wanting to tell a story right there in front of us, and gives us amazing tools to begin to move through that collectively. One of the most interesting things that I am now beginning to add to my understanding of trauma and the U.S. context is the degree to which the process of creating the conditions for chattel slavery required the mechanisms of state and church to inflict the threat of annihilation, to impress it upon the bodies and minds of all of what we now think of as white people, the many Europeans who were fleeing Europe from the 100 Years' War, coming out of a situation of traumatic violence and conflict, and coming here and being pressed into, through threats of violence, into becoming people capable of enormous cruelty that was needed to keep the chattel slavery system functioning. I think we have a lot of conversations to have there in this context about not just the construction of blackness, but the construction of race in terms of the construction of whiteness and the role that violence played in that. So I have a lot more that I could say about trauma, about the way in which our stories get broken, our capacity to see the coherent tale of our lives. But I want to end by, and I'm doing this especially for you as a Presbyterian church, saying something about resilience and healing. People think I'm odd, but one of my favorite figures, historical figures in the world is John Calvin. Yes, I admit it. It's probably some trauma in there, you know? And my first book was on John Calvin and John Calvin's location in Geneva and what was happening at the time. And John Calvin was forming what becomes the theology that is the basis for the theology that created this congregation and continues to sustain it. John Calvin was doing that in the context of mass immigration out of France into the city-state of Geneva from France because of the decimation that was happening from the French crown and the Roman Church because of the beliefs, particularly in the southern part of France, of the Huguenots. Pastors were being executed for sedition. Cities were being burnt to the ground. It was a terrible time, and this was the traumatic stage onto which Calvin stepped. And before he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is his most famous theology book, he wrote a commentary on the Psalms, which he says gives us an anatomy of all parts of the soul. An anatomy of all parts of the soul. And why did he go to the Psalms? Now, if you think about his congregation and who they were, a traumatized people, many of them having lost family members, fleeing their homeland, never to return. And he divides the Psalms into 3 categories. And it's uncanny the way in which his division of the Psalms lines up with what has now become an almost reflexive pattern for talking about the process of healing from trauma. So he begins by talking about the first third of the Psalms, and he calls these the Psalms of praise and trust. And in these Psalms, we are speaking along with the psalmist about God's greatness and God's goodness and God's promise to watch over and care for us. Think Psalm 23. Now, in the classic literature on trauma, an absolutely crucial first step to working with trauma survivors is establishing enough connection that there is trust there, so that what has been hidden or what cannot be grappled with can become voiced. So he begins by talking about the importance of not your church neighbor. He's not excluding your church neighbor. He probably didn't even understand what who your therapist would have been. But he's talking about God, God's self, and what it means to have that spiritual connection as the connection of trust. and safety. I call that grace, a recognition of fundamental grace. The second set of psalms are the psalms of testimony. And these are the psalms where the psalmist just lets it rip. They are, many of them, awful. These are the psalms where you hear about, I want to bash the heads of my enemies' babies against the rocks until they die. I mean, it's like a spewing of anger and hatred and brokenness and just a cacophony of despair and fractured lives. But Calvin tells us what's happening there is absolutely crucial to know that in scriptures we have a space where the trauma of our lives can be spoken, and we needn't be afraid of speaking it. That's right there in our scriptures. But then Calvin goes on to the next step, the third step. And he calls these the Psalms of Thanksgiving. He also calls them the Psalms of Everyday Life. And as Calvin describes his anatomy of the soul, he explains that as all of this comes out, this fractured tale of the harms that we've lived, one eventually reaches a place where it's not as if the world is suddenly and magically made right. It's not as if a wand is waved and the pain is gone. The literature on trauma says you don't ever get over trauma, but you can get through trauma. You move through it. But what happens in these Psalms of Everyday Life is you learn that you, in fact, in the grace of God and in the capacity of your soul, have this remarkable ability to bear it. And to wake up in the morning and bake bread. And to tend the garden. And to sit on the step and have tea with your neighbor. The Psalms of Everyday Life. That place where the profound and radical nature of God's unceasing, unmerited, overabundant love simply invites us to be. Trauma and grace. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Yes, please. I'd like to invite Dr. Justin Johnson to come forward, and as he is getting settled, I will tell you a little bit about him. As Dr. Jones has referenced, we have a brilliant medical doctor in our midst. Dr. Johnson is a psychiatrist at Hopeway, and many of you know about Hopeway. It's an inpatient and outpatient mental health facility here in Charlotte. He serves as their Director of Veteran Affairs. He was born and raised here in North Carolina, went to UNC Chapel Hill. He got his first medical degree at Johns Hopkins, and then continued with his residency and psychiatric residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and McLean Hospital as part of a combined program at Harvard Medical School. There he developed, and then after that, he did a fellowship at UNC Hospitals in psychosomatic medicine. He developed an expertise there in patients with complex medical psychiatric disorders, such as traumatic brain injury. In addition to that, he has expertise in PTSD and is trained in cognitive processing therapy, one of the few evidence-based therapies proven to treat PTSD. He's an assistant consulting professor of psychiatry at Duke University Medical School. See if this helps. I'm seeing. I feel I should start over to give Justin his due. Thank you, Jesse. I will say that you can read his bio in your bulletin, but he is very well qualified to be with us today. And so I will continue where I left off, which is to say that he has an expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder and is trained in cognitive processing therapy, one of the few evidence-based therapies that is proven to treat and to heal PTSD. He's an assistant consulting professor at Duke, as I said, in the medical school there, and he serves in the U.S. Army Reserves. Dr. Johnson's treatment approach involves careful attention to both medical and psychiatric concerns with an emphasis in holistic care. And he and Dr. Jones share this deep awareness, as we've already heard, of how trauma involves the whole person and requires a whole person response. So I invite the two of them into conversation, and as Penn said, they will talk for a little while, and then he will call for your questions a little later. Thank you both for being with us tonight.
Thank you all for having me. Also here, I'm incredibly honored and humbled to be on share the same stage as Dr. Jones. I was going to start just briefly talking, so I think the hope was that I could bring some sort of a medical perspective. Obviously, I'm totally unqualified to comment on theological perspectives. But I think it'd be helpful to talk maybe about Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's book,
Yes.
The Body Keeps the Score, which, have people in here heard of that before? I see a lot of heads shaking. Yes, it's really an incredible book at understanding trauma and trauma's impacts on a person's physical health. And so I think just to talk a little bit, the general idea, sort of a summary of the book, and something that we see in the hospital pretty regularly, is that when traumatic things happen to people, very often they get physical symptoms that manifest from it. And so that's like the idea of the title, The Body Keeps the Score. Physically, you're seeing physical manifestations of intrapsychic distress. I think, most of us can relate to this, even if you've never been through something traumatic before, just on a very basic level, that there's a connection between our mind and our body. Me, for instance, right now coming up here to talk, I get sweaty palms, you get anxious. I think most people probably feel some kind of physical anxiety when you're speaking in front of a group, for example. So that's a very direct example of psychic distress, so that's like anxiety, that's manifesting in physical form. Some people will go throw up. Some people will get diarrhea, you get gastrointestinal distress. And so our psyche can put things into the body. And in PTSD, when people have been traumatized, you often see that even more severely. So there are disorders such as conversion disorder. Has anybody ever heard of that before? I see a few head shakes, yeah. I know we have
Theologically, it means something different, but...
Oh, there is? Okay, I don't even know about that. Okay. What is it? What is it theologically?
No, we talk about conversion a lot, but not...
Okay, yeah. That's over my head. Yeah. So the general idea is like you can get actual serious physical symptoms like paralysis from being traumatized or from having some repressed psychic memory. Freud, was one of the first people to comment on this. And so I thought it was interesting in your talk where you briefly mentioned the amygdala and the frontal lobe. Mm-hmm. If you look at, you can look at these things neuroscientifically. The gist of what's happening is these people are stuck in their amygdala, which is the primitive brain. So that's like our reptilian brain. That's the fight or flight organ in your brain. So where somebody sneaks up behind you in an alley, you're startled. That immediately happens even if you don't have a thought in your head thinking like, who is this person? So people who are traumatized can get stuck in that. And you talked about telling stories. The medically evidenced proven therapies that treat people with PTSD are therapies where you do exactly that. You help them get out of their amygdala, get out of this like primitive brain and get into more of your frontal lobe. I think you talked about that where you're giving language to it. And that's exactly what you would do like in the hospital for people with things like conversion disorder. By the medical conversion disorder is essentially you get a serious neurological impairment. So I've seen people who are paralyzed, for example, even though they don't have any medical evidence that there would be anything causing the paralysis. Or you'll see people with conversion blindness where they can't see anything anymore. And for all intents and purposes, they're totally blind. They're stumbling over things, but the MRI is normal, the neurologic exam is normal. And so that can come from psychological trauma or psychological distress. And the way you treat it medically, so these are in settings that are secular, that are not religious, is through the same approach that Dr. Jones talked about. So I thought that was interesting. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about that, and we can obviously get into it more. We'll start with that.
Yeah. And thank you for all of that. And as I have studied trauma over the years and done it in a theological context and in churches and in my own thinking about faith practices, I've been always, it's like we haven't just discovered trauma, but religious communities have for centuries and centuries been engaged in practices of healing trauma without ever naming it as such. Like, one of the things that Bessel van der Kolk talks about is the importance of making sound and singing. Now, who would ever have thought that us standing up together on Sunday morning and singing hymns is actually a very important therapeutic, transformative practice of our entire bodies with respect to what's happening in our amygdala and healing the harms that have happened to us. I think about how he talks about the importance of art and color and light and movement, all of these dimensions of our lives that we don't normally tap into, but how religious communities, these beautiful windows, how we trace the light as it moves through the sanctuary. Something's happening to our brains and our bodies in all of that we're not even always aware of. And most importantly, when we read these stories in Scripture, we're participating in stories that just simply by virtue of narrating them are, in a sense, knitting our lives back together through that narrative structure. They're giving us a place to find meaning. And as Justin, I know because we talked about this earlier, that it's often the stories that may seem the gloomiest or the harshest, actually, that if they become part of your understanding of how life unfolds, can create resilience in communities, because over time you begin to have resources for thinking things like this happen in the course of human life. So our biblical stories are a source of enormous resilience to us in an embodied sort of way. I'm just building on what you're saying by talking about how churches do things.
And that always reminds me, I know when we talked before, that, in the hospitals, this new thing is that, we're going to do mindfulness-based stress reduction as a type of therapy, or mindfulness, meditative-focused kind of therapies that are medicalized, and we're going to prove this through, science, and it's totally secular. And when you observe it, you basically observe that, well, this is the things that churches have been doing forever. Like, you mean prayer? That's basically what, this is prayer, essentially. And so really, I think people have known that well before medical professionals have started calling it other things. Even like these therapies, like the one you mentioned, I do cognitive processing therapy. The core of what it is exactly what you described, where you help the person retell their narrative. You do something called a trauma narrative, which is basically, you talked about people retelling the story of what happened. That's exactly what you do in the therapy. But now we've called it something, medicalized it, where really it's something I think the church has been doing for a long time.
Yeah. And how that story doesn't always come out like in a pure form.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
Just kind of like comes out. And the job you must do every day is hear all those pieces as they come out and help people put all those pieces eventually together in some sort of framework that, begins to tell a story.
Absolutely. And then another thing that you see is something called moral injury, which I know you know of, that we actually rely a lot on the church to help with. This can happen in people with PTSD. It's essentially where you feel like you've violated some deeply held moral belief. So, for example, I'm in the military and I work with a lot of veterans, so pretty commonly can see things like I killed that woman and child in Iraq. I'm a terrible person. I deserve to be punished, which can ultimately lead to suicide potentially if you feel total despair. And actually, we rely a lot on faith leaders and the chaplains in the church, because frankly, from a medical perspective, we don't really know how to heal that. We don't know how to fix it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on moral injury and your experience with it.
Yeah. It is something that, that, again, if you look back for thousands of years, it's been a sort of topic of discussion in religious stories. And it basically comes down to how do we think about the harm that happens to people when either by chance or by force they do something, they participate in an action that runs absolutely contrary to their deepest beliefs. And moral injury talks about what does that do to a person, to what does that do to a community, what that can do to a community. And how do we talk about that injury where you're not seeing, there's not a cut on your head, but there's a cut in your soul. There's a cut in your sense of self-worth and value. And I think we're, as a society, just beginning to grapple with how do we acknowledge that and take it seriously and begin to help people to understand that even as an injury.
Yeah.
And not just something that you get over.
Yeah. I mean, I'd ideally try to help them reframe it, to try to essentially retell the narrative, to find meaning in that. Like you said, communities can find meaning in trauma. That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger kind of idea. That post-traumatic growth is another term, and so maybe to help them see the meaning in that. That's a lot of medically, let's try to bring the medical perspective we try to help them do through the therapies we do for it.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Should we have a bigger conversation?
Yeah.
While I let those of you who have questions come, now's your chance to come to the microphone up front. You can just do that, and we like to do things decently and in order in the Presbyterian Church, and so I will help make that happen. But you need to line up at the microphone, and then I'll invite you. When you do, you can state your name and ask a question, and then maybe you can engage in conversation, or maybe you can sit back down. You can decide that. But while you're doing that, and this guy asks me questions all the time, so I'm glad he's going to ask you a question. I have a question first, John. I'm going to let you hang on one second. One of the things that is true about our church that you all may not know is that we have a very long 20-plus year partnership with a public school on the west side of Charlotte called Westerly Hills. And we have, for a long time, invested in those kids and those parents and those teachers' lives, and we've tutored and we've fed and we've supported and cheerleaded, but only recently have we realized how important mental health is in the way that we are partners. And so that is preview to the question that I have here. So several in our congregation have read the book, The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Trauma and Adversity by Nadine Burke-Harris. And she emphasizes the long-term consequences of childhood adversity and toxic stress. And so my question is, many people in this room work with children who've experienced toxic stress. What advice can you give them about how to lessen the impact of these early negative experiences?
Do you want to start? Yeah, it's a great question. So I should preface, I don't work with children. I'm not a child psychiatrist, but obviously all of us are products of our childhood, of our development. That's a core feature of being human, is we are how we were raised, essentially. And so early childhood adverse experiences or chronic trauma in childhood can lead to all sorts of things. And so you had talked a bit about like systemic racism, maybe it was on a previous talk, but also sort of systemic trauma. So growing up in a chronically chaotic, traumatic environment, for example. Let's say you don't have consistent access to food, you don't have consistent access to your parents, they're intermittently available because of work or other stresses or poverty. you're in a neighborhood where there's gunshots happening frequently, you're chronically stressed in childhood. So that could have all sorts of biological changes on the body. For example, there's actually a study in American Journal of Psychiatry this past month showing that comparing black and white children, black children who grew up in poorer neighborhoods had increased rates of PTSD, primarily from that kind of systemic childhood adverse experiences just like that. Medically, like neuroscientifically, you can actually see reductions in hippocampus volume in children who have chronic childhood trauma. So your hippocampus is essentially a different part of your brain that's involved in memory storage, and it's thought to be very involved in the development of PTSD. And children who have childhood trauma have lower hippocampal volumes compared to children who don't have adverse childhood experiences. Beyond that, you can have elevated cortisol levels chronically through childhood. Cortisol, have people heard of cortisol before? It's a primary steroid. It's the stress steroid in your body. And so in the short term, it's a good thing. So for example, if you were in a car accident, or let's say you had an attacker who was coming towards you, you would want to increase your cortisol because it makes you more alert and more vigilant and respond to whatever the threat is. But chronically, it's not a good thing. It has all sorts of negative medical effects. So if you're a child growing up with chronically elevated cortisol, potentially lower hippocampal volume, you don't have immediate access to as much food, you're not going to develop as well. That can obviously lead to all sorts of problems as an adult. Not only PTSD, another interesting point to note is that chronic childhood trauma can often lead to development of personality disorders. So that's different than PTSD. A lot of times people will talk about trauma, and they'll say this person has trauma and they have a trauma disorder. And to be specific with the language, what they might mean is that the person has a personality disorder. So borderline personality disorder is the most prevalent one we see as therapists, because they're most likely to present for help. And essentially what a personality disorder is you have developed, because you're growing up in a chaotic, turbulent, traumatic environment, you may have unreliable adults around you. You essentially develop disrupted attachments to other people. And a personality disorder is where you chronically, sort of a summary is you have chronically disrupted attachments to people. And that can be different than PTSD, although it can overlap with it. And so people with personality disorders, in general, they have a difficult time interacting with people. So beyond all the other things we talked about, they can have trouble navigating the world as adults just because they're difficult. That's sort of the interpersonal, that's the core definition of it. And so that's just a few examples of how it can manifest. Obviously, and I think you also asked about ways to improve it. I mean, there's a whole variety of, I don't think I have every answer to that, like policy proposals, how do you improve poverty, and how do you improve access to food and good education and racism and things like that I don't have an answer to. I think there are a lot of ideas around that.
There's a trauma theorist that I just think is an amazing writer and thinker named Annie Rogers. And she tells a story of when she was just starting to work with children around trauma. She was assigned by the court a group of 10 to 13-year-old girls who had been assigned to meet with her as a group because they had all come from the court because they were survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And she writes about this process and how it was a 12-week series of sessions. There were like 10 young women. And for the first 8, she would come in and she would ask them questions, and they would sit there and not say anything. She would come in and ask them to move around the room and do things or enact things. They wouldn't move. They're just like non-responsive. And then she happened over the weekend be reading some William Carlos Williams and some free verse. And she said, I wonder what would happen if I just read them some free verse. And so she came in and she put some free verse poetry on the whiteboard. And she said, okay, now I want you to write me a poem like this. It doesn't have to make any sense, and it doesn't have to be in any order. And the dam broke. And these kids just started pouring everything out. And what she talks about is that if we have preconceived notions of the structure that we're going to impose upon a situation for children in particular process, then it can oftentimes be a hindrance. And so creating conditions under which it can come out in as much chaos as it needs to come out in. And that can sometimes be asking them to draw a picture, and just use colors. I just find her on healing in children really a powerful.
It's probably pretty interesting. You said she was writing poetry.
She asked them to write poetry,
language, frontal lobe to get into the amygdala.
But it wasn't structured words. It was words that weren't structured. So it went through the frontal lobe, but the lack of structure made it
access
that chaotic part.
Yeah, it's sort of, that's a little bit like, psychoanalytic therapy, where essentially, I think you had talked about too, you just come in and just talk, and there is no structure, and you sort of just process and eventually get to traumatic things. Probably, I assume it's a similar kind of mechanism.
Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah.
Ken, I think you set me up, but it's not the first time. Dr. Jones, I'm going to address mine to you, if I may. Move from the secular over here for a little bit. And it deals with the pandemic and its result for a sustained time, learning loss for children outside of a social setting that I think is favorable in their lives, and the trauma that goes on at home from parents that are working or absent during the day, and older siblings that have parental obligations all of a sudden cast on them. And we've got a large number of our children in Title I schools and who are living in poverty and abysmal proficiency ratings in both reading and math. So, as I have read in the past about ACEs, we haven't had this one. And it very much qualifies in my judgment, and I'm worried about the collective impact through time, given the number of kids that have been affected by this. In Charlotte, we have over half of our schools that are Title I. So and we're talking about 150, 60,000 kids in the school system. So this is not a minor piece of our public. And so what does the church need to be doing?
It's in New York City, 2/3 of the schools are Title I schools. I can't describe better than you have what the situation is. You have an already broken down public education system in communities where functional support structures have been fractured, and then you add onto an already sort of broken terrain a pandemic that brings just a tornado of added stress, and you have a catastrophe. You have we are in a state of catastrophe now. It's nothing less than that in terms of what this generation of children are facing and will grow up with if we don't make decisive decisions to engage it directly. It is the pandemic, but it's what the pandemic confronted when it came. So you can have conditions in which you can have a pandemic and not experience traumatic stress. Pandemics are terrifying situations, as we all know. We've just come through it. But it's the context in which it was experienced with no support, or an already a situation where the cortisol levels are off the charts, the hippocampus is not functioning right, startle reflexes of children are already all discombobulated, and then you have a sustained siren going off in the background of the pandemic, and it just blows the circuits. As to what churches should be doing, why are we all, as a society, our churches included, leading the way up in arms about this situation of our children in this country and what the pandemic has done and the conditions that the pandemic confronted when it came? And those conditions continue. It's a moral crisis. Talk about moral injury, we're all participating in it right now by not engaging it. And these are our children. So I'm not giving you a policy answer, but I am giving a moral call for this to stay central to the life of our churches and where we put our energy. And as Justin said, that also involves confronting systemic anti-blackness and racism in this country, and poverty. And the poverty is only increasing, and the violence just endemic to our nation is only increasing. And one of the things that I always have to deal with when I'm talking to people about trauma is to allow people to hear what I'm saying. You have to do it in such a way that well, as Justin did, helps to medicalize it, it helps to tell stories about it, but we are living in a moment where that traumatic thread is so tightly taut throughout our culture, and at many places it's shredding and it's breaking. And our churches, what else is it that we're called to do if we're not called to engage that? And we have a crucified Jesus who lived that life, engaging that reality, and said, this is who God is in our midst.
I want to add to that too, because I know we're sort of having a conversation. Two things that reminded me of, if you look at things that are proven to boost resilience, so resilience is your general sort of common sense, like it prevents development of PTSD. Two factors that are proven to create stronger resilience are one, a supportive collective community, and two, more time spent in prayer. And so I think those are two things that medically you would say the church is, obviously, it's the church basically. And so I think anything you can do, this was to your original question to me, as a community to be a communal support for these children, but also to encourage prayer, I think could help. Somebody was going to ask.
Hi, my name is Emily. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm very interested in all of this. I spent the past 2 years as an educator in a Title I school in CMS, and something that I observed in my experience working with children and families was that not only were the children experiencing the adverse childhood experiences, but many of them were because their parents were also under incredible stress. They were home alone for 2 years, some of them, because their parents couldn't afford childcare. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been alone. And so I'm wondering, in that context where, and also as an educator, we experienced traumatizing events at our school as well. And so we all were trying to help the kids as much as we could, but it's really, really difficult when the caregivers, the teachers, the parents are also under incredible stress. And one thing I noticed in particular that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, how do you have these kinds of conversations about trauma with families in an effort to help the kids and to help everybody without, I don't know how to frame this part of the question. Some parents were very hesitant to talk about trauma because they were getting they thought we were saying, this is your fault, you traumatized your child. Intergenerational trauma is really real, it affects everybody, and so I'm wondering, how do you talk about that with families in a way that's non-judgmental, is trying to help everybody, but just recognizing it's complicated?
You want to start? No? Okay. Yeah, it is very complicated. Yeah, so I was trying to go to her. This is one personal thing I try to do. Actually, try to not medicalize trauma as much, even though I've sat up here talking about medical stuff for 35 minutes. So I try to not use the term trauma. I think you mentioned this, and it gets way overused. And I worry that particularly among young people, I don't just worry, this is proven true, that when you plant the idea in the head that someone is going to develop a disorder and that they've been traumatized, it promotes them developing a disorder. And so we need to do the opposite. And so I don't actually use the term trauma unless it's met the medical definition, which means it's been a specific, direct event where you felt like your life was in danger. So like being shot at, or getting in a car accident, a rape, a physical assault. And so, it gets way more loosely used by people, I've been traumatized with this or that, which I would consider you had stressful experiences. So I try to use very specific language because I think language is important. And also, we've talked about how language leads to development of ideas and narratives. And if you set up the idea that you are going to be hurt by this and you're going to develop a disorder, you will develop a disorder. And so I actually try to normalize, this sucks. You provide a space for them to grieve and validate their experiences while also setting up the idea that you will get better, that you're resilient and you will get through this, and we're going to figure out ways to help you do that. So I try to not medicalize it, and I try to not use the term trauma. I use it very carefully, essentially.
I think just one small piece of that is I think that we also, when it comes to parenting, and particularly when it comes to poor communities and communities of color, we have such a heavy-handed criminalizing discourse around quote behaviors that are blaming and criminalizing. And so this is just making a comment about how our culture around race and criminalization, our carceral culture, intersects with our ability to have conversations that actually can provide the possibility of healing, but it's very hard to do that in a context where you have absolutely no reason to trust that the system will actually support you and not punish you for being honest about what's happened and how hard it's been. So, and I know you know that because you work in the middle of it every day, so.
Hi, my name's Evan Bill. I'm a third-year student at the other Union Seminary here on the Charlotte campus. And I also have an interest in military chaplaincy. And so I'm really fascinated by your discussion of moral injury this evening. And I wanted to talk about how you spoke on the collective aspects of trauma, and I was wondering if we could expound more on the collective aspects of moral injury, especially with the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and what is the role of the church and the responsibility of our faith to speak on these collective aspects of institutional betrayal.
You want to start that? Go ahead.
If you want to collect your thoughts, I can comment on something.
Yeah,
Piece
go
of
ahead.
that. Definitely I want to talk to a recruiter. I want to get you in the Army if you definitely. I'm always recruiting people. I love the Army. Anybody who's interested in joining. Chaplains are an incredibly important piece of mental health support in the military. Mm-hmm. But to that question, I've seen it, clinically with people, particularly during the Afghanistan withdrawal. It felt like there was a collective moral injury among Afghanistan veterans, saying, what was the point? Why did I go there? Why were my buddies killed when we just withdrew rapidly and the Taliban immediately took over? So I think that's the most recent very specific collective moral injury that I've seen in veterans and active duty soldiers still as well. Although it's pretty common among veterans to see a collective moral injury, like a general mistrust of leadership above them. And the ways we approach helping with that is the same way we've talked about for a few minutes, is to help them continue to try to find meaning in the narrative that happened, through essentially processing it, talking about recreating the narrative, being a support. So this was to that point a minute ago, just being there. It doesn't actually... the most basic principle of being a good therapist is just being a good person. So just yeah, man, that sucks. I hear you. And just being supportive and listening and validating. Those are sort of the approaches we've taken so far.
One thing that I have, I experienced it at the Riverside Church in New York City, which is right next door to Union. And I know that it's happened in congregations across the country, but around moral injury, and particularly with areas in which you have a critical mass of veterans, having processes like a truth and reconciliation hearings, where you're actually able to stand up and tell the story publicly, and it's actually, with moral injury, it's very important for not only for the person, let's say, who participated in bombing a village in which a mother and a child were killed, but it's also important in those contexts of telling the story is to experience the response of the people who were harmed. Because if that is just a big blank space in your own healing process, you're not going to heal. And so that has to be a responsive process. And so we saw the first Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa when South Africa realized that getting over the history of apartheid was going to take more than just stopping the practices. Actually, the healing that needed to take place was the moral healing of the literally centuries of harm that had been inflicted. And that required giving testimony, being witnessed, and being heard, and being, a conversation that's often quite painful, but it's the truth around the impact of these events. So I think churches are great places, are special places for that kind of conversation to happen. Because if you experience moral injury, it doesn't do any good for someone to tell you that's not really a big deal, that mother and child died, and it's not your fault, so you don't really have to feel bad about it. Because it is a big deal. And sometimes actually getting to hear from people who have been on the other side of it is actually part of putting you back together, because the reality of what's happened is there. So.
I'd love to know your thoughts too, because a lot of times when you see when the people get better is essentially forgiveness, like when they're able to forgive themselves or feel some sense of forgiveness, and that obviously.
Yeah. But it's hard to get to forgiveness when you can't even get the reality of what's the harm is out there. It's like, and Christians do this all the time. We like to move to forgiveness really fast,
Just done with
it's like, okay,
go home.
bad scene, okay, forgiven, let's move on. And I think that's we have a hard time getting what is to be forgiven, what is to be engaged, even there before us in all of its reality. By the way, on all this topic, I just last night watched, and I recommend it to people, Women Talking. It's just an extended reflection on women in a community where there's been years of sexual abuse, and they're trying to figure out how to heal. And it's all about forgiveness and healing and what to do. So I recommend it. On Netflix? Amazon, yeah. Have you seen it?
One of the two.
It's on there.
Yeah.
You just put Women Talking in.
My name is Faye. I'm a first-year seminarian and have background in healthcare. And so what the two of you represent is, in some way, a combining of my experience. So I find myself wondering, I really appreciate your comments about what the church is doing for what we need to be doing in community from a medical perspective and a church perspective, what we need to be doing in our schools. But I just find myself wondering, what are we doing to put these two forces together? Is there a frontier where we're getting to the point where we can partner more intimately with the church and the very real benefit that comes from the medicalized treatment of these issues? Can you give us resources? Can you point us in a direction? Is there somebody out there blazing a trail? Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank First Pres for making it happen. No, we have at Union, our whole chaplaincy program is it's a very practice-based, and it is the space where the medical, the therapeutic, and the theological, and multi-religious theological, and I have to say just existential, come together to create the blend of energies that you need to take on something, like this.
Yeah. I think in terms of medicine, there's over the past few years, there's been more of an emphasis on like holistic health care would be the term, or whole person health is a term the VA uses. where we're not just focused on, okay, this specific cell did this, let me give you a pill to target that. It's really focused on the person as a human being, and so trying to do better nutrition, better physical exercise, and then also a piece of that would be spirituality. So hopefully that will continue to improve across hospital healthcare systems. Definitely to speak to the military point, the military, I think, does a pretty good job of it because chaplains have existed in the Army at least well before psychiatrists did as the primary mental health professionals in the Army, and still probably most soldiers prefer to go to the chaplains for that. And so in some ways, the civilian medical system, I think, could benefit from learning from that.
My name is Chris Steglin. I'm a recently retired cancer surgeon. And it's very interesting to me, Dr. Johnson, that you cited that there's evidence that resilience is fostered by prayer and a supportive community.
Yes, that's one of, if you look at things, basically people have tried to identify protective factors that essentially promote resilience, and those are two of them. The community also extends to basically like individual relationships, so having a partner who supports you.
And I've certainly seen that in my practice over the years, a wide variability in the resilience of individuals to handle difficult, stressful situations. I also did a lot of trauma surgery, but it wasn't so much managing those families except managing the patient at the beginning. With that in mind, is the decline in church membership and participation in organized religion, where we are so much more a society of individuals now. And along with that, there would be a decline in supportive communities and decline in prayer. Is there any evidence that as a society we're less resilient today than we might have been 50 years ago or 100 years ago? I think about in my own family history, I have a grandmother who was orphaned twice. She lost both sets of parents. Her first set from tuberculosis, the next set, her adopted aunt and uncle from a car accident. Now, she did suffer major depression, but she came through it. And I just wonder I think there was a book about the Columbine bowling alone.
Yes.
Talking about the isolation of us as people, as individuals. I'm wondering if that level of resilience that we know that we get from prayer and community support, if there's evidence that we're a less resilient population today than we were years ago, because we have less of that in our lives.
I personally think that is true, and I think people have written about it, I can't remember if that's Charles Murray or who wrote Bowling Alone, but a few other books and articles have been written from the same idea. Not only that it's not good for resilience, but also that it's not good for democracy. That the decline in institutions beyond churches, but community groups and things like that. That was the whole idea of the book. So I personally think yes. I sort of see it in individual, particularly young people that I see, or particularly I focus a lot on men's mental health and young male mental health, a directionlessness of young men who aren't really attached to community organizations like church and other things. So I think yes, even though I can't cite studies to prove that.
Yes.
Dr. Jones, have you?
Yes.
You think that is in fact what we're experiencing?
No. Yes, I do think that is true. But there's the generation of students that are coming to seminary give me a lot of hope. And I think I would feel more despairing about the loss of community if they weren't still pouring in the doors of Union, coming to figure out how to be community and to live together and to ask the big questions and wrestle with truth and transcendence. And I just think that what social media has done to us as a culture, how that's going to get cathected through us, and what community is going to look like as we wrestle with the isolation we've created. Because I think people recognize that they need each other. But something is emerging. I don't know what it is, but I'm hopeful about the possibility of emerging places of connection, and that are deeply spiritual. I don't know if our churches are going to be that place. I hope our churches are. But
I've often wondered if some sort of institution will develop
I think
that's
so.
different than the church.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily theologically based, but that functions the way our churches have functioned in the past.
Yeah.
It strikes me, I've spent a lot of time in small communities. My father was from a town of 300 people in Iowa. And it used to be all of the social structure of those small communities was church-based. Today, the worst problems of drug addiction and hopelessness seems to be in our rural communities. Whereas there are difficult areas, of course, everywhere, but in the past, we didn't have problems like that in the small towns. And now that seems to be pretty consistent.
They have the highest rates of deaths of despair, too, which is a term we use to summarize suicides and overdoses.
In rural communities?
Yes, they're particularly among males. It's the same people I described earlier, this directionlessness and...
And don't you think 50 years ago that would have been entirely different?
Oh, totally, yeah. I think.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all for letting a United Methodist interloper into the room.
Oh, no.
We've been talking about how the church can be a help in all of this. What I find is more often the church is the culprit, right? People have been traumatized by images,
church.
visions of God, language about God. Whatever that they have gotten from the church has actually been the affliction. How do we think about that theologically, and how does the church wrestle with that situation?
Yeah. I can speak directly from the experience of being the president of a seminary where amongst the students coming through the doors, still just full of so much hope and energy and resilience, and they are part of this emerging thing. But so many of it, it's amazing to me that they come to seminary having experienced so much harm in their churches. And I think in particular of the LGBTQ and trans communities, just extremely talented, brilliant young people who want to serve God and have a deep sense of spirituality, who have been cast out of their religious communities. Or those who haven't been cast out, but they've just been shut down. So I just named that as one of the places, but we also know, that the church has been the site of all kinds of abuse. And the sad thing to me is that, actually Carol and I were talking about this today, is that in our broader culture, too often now, the younger generations hear the word church and they think of all of these terrible things. And they have missed, the fact that there are actually healthy, functioning, positive, constructive, liberating spaces called churches that exist still today too. But so changing that story is something we need to work on. But yes, throughout history, the church has done as much great things as it has horrific things. So that's just the story of Easter, of the crucifixion.
I appreciate how you've touched on so many aspects of our society in terms of trauma, public education, mental health, religion. I want to ask about our criminal justice system, and I realize that's a whole other session probably, but specifically hearing you talk about putting one's narrative together, one's story, and the healing aspect of telling it in community, and how that is may or may not be done in terms of testifying, is what I'm thinking about specifically. When a victim or a perpetrator comes into the courtroom to tell their story, is that a healing? Can it be a healing experience? And is our criminal justice system what can we do better in terms of that healing, I guess is what I'm really asking.
That is a big question.
So you take that.
That's a very big question. But this is not an answer to it, but this is just one quick story. Union, along with a sister seminary, New York Theological Seminary, runs a program in Sing Sing, which is the men's maximum security prison, and then Bedford Hills, which is a women's maximum security prison. And it's a program where in a year you can get a master's of professional studies, but it basically is a degree that qualifies you to go to work in churches. And these programs are always oversubscribed. I've taught in them before. I tell you, it's the best students you ever teach because they do all the reading.
Very motivated. Yeah.
No, and they come with very detailed questions. I mean, it's like intense teaching. And a large part of what happens in those programs is this, what we've been talking about, but telling stories and then learning to tell your story in the context of Scripture and theology. But the recidivism rate of those programs is something like it's 98% of people never return, which is just off the charts in terms of what our carceral system does to people. But that's just a little instance. I mean, the problem of mass incarceration in this country, when you put it also next to it's deeply tied to the whole question of the crisis of our children, but it's also tied to a crisis around how we even understand what policing is, and how we think about. We have to go back and talk about the history of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and then Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, and what that did to specifically black communities in the United States, decimated them. It was basically a war created to put black people in prisons and shut them away. I'm just being kind of blunt here about this. I'm not talking about trauma specifically, but what I have described is traumatic and violent, and it is something that our churches need to be speaking about. We incarcerate in the United States, I'll just say this one thing, we incarcerate in the United States 25% of the people who are incarcerated globally are incarcerated in the United States, and half of those are black. So there's something traumatic happening there. And not just in the general clinical sense, not just in a kind of vague sense, but actually violent and traumatic.
Mm-hmm. The last question.
No pressure. I just thought I just need to ask, because I get the incredible pleasure to serve at an institution that connects me with many different churches. God only knows why I'm put there. And I also have incredible children that have been called into systems that are so incredibly broken. How are we as institutions that are called to serve congregations, institutions that are called to serve people with addiction and mental health issues, that are called together to serve schools? How are we forming connectional bridges? Because I see and am with students in seminary that feel so incredibly called, and have children that feel so incredibly called to serve these institutions, and have recently experienced a child that is serving daily on the lines of Title I schools and was so incredibly broken. And now, luckily, because she had left the institution she'd left the church. And here her mama serves for the church. And now, thankfully, she's going back to congregations because faith. But I say all that, but how do we start? I keep seeing this vision of, gosh, if we can only get together as seminaries, as churches, as building these bridges across presbyteries, across synods, across denominational lines, that there's a network that I think can help heal. I don't know where to start that, but for some reason, I just keep seeing it. So I just offer that to say any idea of how to start really being serious about connection, making these connections across to heal these structures so that people can enter back into communities of faith. Because there's lots of us that have left, but yet are being called back to serve in those capacities, and there's such healing. But I can also see there's not only that I think we have those on a broad level, the ability to bring people together and start to heal our world. But where do we start?
I kind of think you just answered your own question. No, you are. I mean, we are the leaders we're waiting for. I mean, there is no magic wand to wave. It's the hard work of doing it. And you're absolutely right. It needs to happen, and it is happening. I'll just end with just on that note, one last thing. You know, as the pandemic was descending on our country, we had the largest mass movement in the history of our nation happen on the lawns of capitals across the country. Never have we even had a social movement half that size get mobilized over the summer of 2020. I mean, it was incredible to see what happened, and it was multi-generational and multiracial and multi-religious, and now we act as if it never happened. But we saw it. Many of us were there. We saw it. It happened, and it can keep happening. But it's just fascinating to me that it literally is by numbers and by just the sheer diversity of it. Nothing like that has ever happened in the United States before of that magnitude. And it happened, and it can happen again. So.
Well, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Jones, thank you. I'm reminded by my colleague Gerald that the Franciscan Richard Rohr said, if we do not transform our pain, we will most certainly transmit it. And you have instructed us on how we might transform some of our pain and be present with others in ways that God's grace is evident. So thank you both for being here tonight. I can't let anybody leave without giving a little bit of a commercial, because this congregation, First Pres, is acutely aware of the grief and trauma in our own community and the need that we have for quality, accessible mental health care and counseling in the Uptown corridor. And so part of our congregation's response has been to partner with Sun Counseling and Wellness, who has provided 2 therapists that are housed in our building. If you've ever been to the Fresco lobby in our church, that is where the counseling center is today. The center is available for sliding and full pay scale, and one of those therapists, Andrea Juarez, is here with us tonight. Where is she? You have to stand up. Come on, stand up. Thank you, Andrea, for being here. So I definitely want you to be aware of that personally, as well as for your networks, that there is a counseling center that exists here in the Uptown corridor. In a second, we're going to adjourn to the Wood Fellowship Hall, where you will find refreshments as well as resources. So that's to your left, out that door, or if you want to go out that's kind of the front, that door, and around, you can get to the Fellowship Hall. We will have resources there from over a dozen mental health providers that are listed in your bulletin. You will also find Stephen ministers who are members of our church with name tags. These are folks trained to be compassionate listeners in caring relationships with people who are going through a difficult period. I'm also happy to announce that the next Willard Lecture, 2024, will be, as we continue to provide a lecture series that addresses human dignity and justice and inclusion. We're pleased to announce that in March of next year, our Willard Lecture will be the Reverend Brian McLaren. Brian is an author, activist, speaker, and public theologian. He's a former English teacher and pastor, and is passionate about advocating for a new kind of Christianity that is just, generous, and works with people of all faiths for the common good. You'll hear more about that at the beginning of the year. So again, thank you to you both. Thank you all for being here, and let us adjourn to the fellowship hall for the reception. Thank you.